without further ado, Mr. Szabo.
Thanks. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming out this morning. That was a really great overview of mental health. I'm going to try and go a little bit more in depth briefly and then leave time for question and answers. So my introduction is actually a really great story of how mental health education in this country has changed. I actually became the director of outreach of the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign in 2002. So the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign was the nation's first ever public health approach to addressing mental health. It came about from the Surgeon General's report on suicide and mental health in 1999, and it was started by the Clinton administration at the White House before they left. Now, if you think about this, we've had many public health approaches to cancer, to diabetes, to heart problems, to everything else, but the very first public health approach to removing the stigma around mental health issues started in 1999. In 2002, when I became the director of outreach, there were no large-scale mental health presentations in this country for adults or young people. So our first task in 2002 was to create large-scale mental health assemblies. So from 2002 to 2006, I went out, I spoke to probably over 500,000 young people, and the idea was, let's develop a system of how you can do this kind of presentation. In 2006, we created the first youth mental health speakers bureau in the country, and then from 2006 to 2010, we rolled it out, developed awareness campaigns to let people know statistically what's impacting them, what's affecting them, what they should be looking for, what's happening. In 2010, I had been speaking about my personal story for like 8 years nationally in like 5 cities a week, all over the country. I had written a book called Behind Happy Faces, so I burned out. And I did what anyone does when they burn out. I joined the Peace Corps. I was like, oh man, I'm so exhausted. I'm gonna go live in Southern Africa for a couple of years. So I lived in Botswana for 2.5 years, and the whole time I was there, I was thinking, well, what am I gonna do next? Am I gonna go into international work? And in my mind, my very young mind, I was like, oh, but mental health will be figured out by the time I get back. I probably won't even have a job. When I got home at the end of 2012, the Newtown shooting happened in Connecticut. And in 2013, the Obama administration had the second ever White House conference on mental health. So the first one was in '99, the second one was in 2013. And at the 2013 White House conference on mental health, President Obama used all of the same statistics that President Clinton used in 1999. And so as I was sitting there, I was like, oh, nothing's changed. We're not growing. We're not expanding. This isn't getting better. And so I had the idea of, instead of continuing to go out and just speak, we needed to develop a curriculum that taught mental health the same way we teach physical health. And it needed to be a part of everyone's education as opposed to something you do on the side. And so I started a company called the Human Power Project, which was designed to create mental health curriculum for people of all ages, but mainly focusing on that kind of K through 12 level. And so I launched it in 2013. By 2016, there was probably about 100,000 students nationwide using the curriculum. And then I was consulting with UCLA, and they came to me, and they were starting a middle school, high school on UCLA's campus. And so they asked me, what would you do if you got to start a school? And I told them I would have a wellness department, and we would teach mental health once a week to all students from grades 6 through 12, no matter who they are, no matter what's happening, to teach them these issues. And so they hired me, and I became a founding faculty member of a middle school, high school that's on UCLA's campus called Geffen Academy at UCLA. So if you think about this from a public health approach, it's kind of a really interesting story. I've always asked myself, what are the gaps and how can we fill them? And originally the gap was, well, there's no large-scale presentation about this. Then the gap was, there's no actual curriculum about mental health. And then the gap was, what if we could just change education entirely to focus at some point on mental health and developing coping skills and communication strategies and learning it. Now, you don't get to have any of these roles if you just have like some shiny, happy story. Like, I didn't wake up one day and was like, hey, my life is so great. I should tell people how great life is. I've actually been through a lot, and I have a really intense personal story with mental health. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 16. When I was a senior in high school, I was hospitalized for attempting to take my own life. But at the time, I wasn't on anyone's radar. I was the president of my class, a varsity basketball player, involved in every student organization possible, volunteering, had a high GPA. And so I had this huge external life that everybody saw, and an internal life that was completely different. When I got out of the hospital and went back to high school, things were different. I was no longer just the cool guy. I was no longer the guy that everyone looked at and everyone liked. I had a lot of people call me a psycho and call me a crazy kid and spread rumors about me in the very small town in Pennsylvania that I grew up in. And so a couple months after getting out of that hospital, a psychologist came into one of my classrooms to talk about the patients he treated. And as he talked about those patients, everyone in the classroom just started laughing. Not really laughing at me, but laughing nervously. And I got really angry. And I took my teacher out in the hallway and I was like, this isn't funny. And he said, well, what do you want to do about it? And I was like, well, let me speak. And so 2 weeks later, I stood up in the exact same classroom and I spoke about my story with bipolar disorder for the very first time. And that was kind of the impetus. The impetus came from a teacher believing in me and trusting me. And so I continued to tell my story as I went through many more challenges. I went to American University for 2 months and had a relapse with bipolar disorder and had to go home. Then I was in and out of hospitals and colleges for the next 4 years before I ultimately returned to American University 4 years after I started and went on to get a degree in psychology and go into the fancy career I just talked about. So when we talk about mental health, there's a couple of things that are really important. I think the most important thing is having a clear definition of what it is. Like he said in my introduction, mental health is not having a problem. When most people hear the words mental health, they immediately think it's depression and suicide and schizophrenia and school shootings. But mental health is not having stress or lack of sleep or any definable issue, it's how you address it. Much like physical health isn't having problems, it's how you take care of yourself. Mental health is the same thing. So students really need that clear definition because even at their young age, it has been ingrained in them that mental health equates to having a problem. It's not. We need to start with that definition. The second thing is a lot of people like to use statistics. All the awareness campaigns that I've run and I'm a part of use statistics. The statistics are scary. 20% of high school students have a diagnosable mental health disorder. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for high school students. They're not sleeping. They are stressed out. They have a lot of other issues happening. The problem with awareness campaigns has been we've gone out and let everyone know how messed up they are, but we haven't taught them what they can do about it. And that is the biggest problem. When mental health stops at awareness, it doesn't teach skills. It would be the equivalent of me sitting all of you in this room and being like, all right, here's the deal. You all have cancer and diabetes and heart problems, and you're all probably gonna die. And then when you were like, what can we do about it? I'd be like, I don't know. Talk to a doctor. I was just here to tell you you're gonna die. And all of you would be like, I don't understand. Why is this your approach? But that's what we've been doing with young people. We've been going out and telling them that they're stressed out, that they don't sleep, that they have anxiety, that they have depression, that they could be bullied, that they could take their own lives, and we haven't taught them the skills. And then when they ask what they can do about it, we say talk to a counselor. We love to promote the concept of seeking help, and I am in favor of that, but the reality is good help and mental health care in this country does not exist. It does not exist at the levels that it's needed. Even people who have means, who have health care, who have all kinds of things, can't get the help they need. So we still need to promote seeking help. We need to build that infrastructure, but it's time to move past awareness and start teaching actual skills to students about their mental health. So what are the skills we can teach them? Well, there's a bunch. I'm going to give you an overview. I think the first thing is how we talk about mental health actually is really important. So the spectrum of mental health that most people are familiar with is like on one side of the spectrum you're sane, and then on the other side of the spectrum, you have like paranoid schizophrenia. This is not a mental health spectrum. This is a very dangerous mental illness spectrum. And the reason it's dangerous is you can have paranoid schizophrenia and be sane. So if you're in two places on the same spectrum, the spectrum's broken. The more dangerous thing about this spectrum is that it promotes seeking help only if you have a diagnosable problem and not before it. That's not how we treat physical health. None of you in your entire lives ever heard, you don't need to work out until you get cancer. You don't need to take care of yourself until you break your leg. We don't use that spectrum for physical health. The spectrum we use for physical health is that you should maintain yourself, take care of yourself, and then if something happens, you know what to do. We promote seeking help for physical health in a normalized, positive, sustainable way. None of you ever see someone leaving a gym and think, oh, what a weirdo. They're not naturally thin and strong. They have to work at it, but I am so much better than them. You see someone leaving the gym and you're like, wow, good for them. We need to change that mental health spectrum in a way that promotes actual mental health and not isolating mental illness. When we isolate mental illness, we don't open options for this. So we need to change the language we actually use around mental health. The second part of it is most students today are having a competition to see who can be more stressed out. And the way this plays out is one student says to another student, hey, I didn't sleep last night. I have a test I have to study for and a paper I have to write, and I'm not going to sleep tonight because my life is stressful. And the next student, instead of being like, oh, that sucks for you, like I'm cool, is like, no, I have 2 tests. I have 3 papers. I volunteer in 6 organizations and play 7 instruments and 4 sports. I just got a job to help feed my family. My life is harder than your life. If your students are having a competition to see who can be more stressed out, it's a competition no one actually wins. Because the winner of that competition is the most burned out person you know. Now, I would argue that the biggest model for students having a competition to be stressed out is us, is the adults, who are also having a competition to see who can be more stressed out and more busy. But there is a huge difference between good stress and bad stress. Good stress is a motivating factor. It activates your fight or flight mechanism. It releases dopamine as you get things accomplished. Good stress is what successful people use on an everyday basis. Bad stress is the opposite. It's headaches, it's insomnia, it's body aches, it's moodiness, it's just a lot of things of feeling overwhelmed and debilitated. The issue is when I say just the word stress to all of you in this room, how many of you immediately think of good stress? How many of you immediately think of bad stress? And so what neuroscience studies are showing is that the younger that a person starts processing stress as solely being bad, is it sets up a host of problems for them. It sets up more openness to getting sick all the time or being tired all the time. But it further down the road sets up consequences where they don't live to full life expectancy. They have higher rates of cancer, diabetes, of all these other problems because they're in this chronic state of stress from middle school through the rest of their lives. We can teach good stress. We can teach neuroscience tools that reframe stress, that take power in stress, that stop catastrophizing stress, so that people are processing in a different way through their adolescence, setting them up to be better examples or better routes for adulthood. The second thing is sleep. Neuroscientists have found that the most effective way to break a human being down is to only allow them to sleep for 3 to 5 hours a day. When militaries around the world capture prisoners of war, it's not like the movies where they keep them awake for 24 hours, because someone who stays awake for 24 hours doesn't break down, they actually become delusional. There's nothing useful about interrogating delusional people. So neuroscientists have found that the easiest way to break a human being down is to only allow them to sleep for 3 to 5 hours a day. The average student in this country sleeps for 4 to 6 hours a day, which is right in line with the easiest way to break down. Sleep is important. And then outside of that, coping skills are vital. So we exercise, we work out, we eat right to take care of our bodies. Coping skills are the building blocks of the brain. And coping skills often develop well before someone is aware of what a coping skill is. So before I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I had some really terrible things happen to me. At age 11, my oldest brother was placed in a psychiatric ward when he was a sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania. 3 months after that, my grandmother died. 10 months after that, my best friend was killed. And 3 months after that, my grandfather died. So from the ages of 11 to 12, I went through massive amounts of loss and change. Now, between the ages of 11 and 12, no one ever sat me down and was like, hey, we need to think about how you're coping. We need to work on this. And the coping skill that I developed between ages 11 and 12 was I learned at that age I wasn't really good at philosophizing about life and death with adults, but I could make them laugh. And so I learned at a really young age that I could put on a happy face, that I could make everyone laugh, that I could make everyone smile, but I never expressed my own emotions. And no one ever came to me and was like, this is how you should do it. But in that developmental stage, I developed a coping mechanism that was, I'm going to make everyone laugh, I'm going to hide my pain. And then at age 13, after my friend was killed, I started drinking. Not all the time, but enough. Enough to the point by age 16, my coping mechanisms grew into binge drinking at every emotional trigger I had, and to the point of passing out and hiding my emotions because that's all I knew. So before I was ever diagnosed, before I ever even had any symptoms of bipolar disorder, I hid my feelings and I drank. And I drank before I learned to talk about my emotions. So as I went through 16 to 22, it didn't really matter so much that I had a diagnosis and a treatment and all these other things. It mattered that my coping skills had formed before it. And I have spent the better part of my adult life trying to understand coping mechanisms and change them. So if we can start teaching about what are effective and ineffective coping mechanisms for people of all ages at a young age, in a productive way, in a proactive way, it does help build those building blocks of mental health. Because the reality is, by high school, most students have already formed their coping mechanisms. Their study habits, their communication skills, there are a lot of other things. There's a really fascinating neuroscience study called Why You Never Really Leave High School. It's a feel-good story. I encourage all of you to read it. But essentially it says all of your experiences with loss, change, and rejection first happen in high school. And what they did was they took studies of people that were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s and found that when they enter the workplace, they immediately snap back to who they were in high school. They immediately snap back in a workplace dynamic of, oh, well, I wasn't popular, so no one's going to really want to talk to me, or they overcompensate for it, or they do all other kinds of things. This time period in your kids' lives is shaping them for their future. And what's happening in their brains is they're simultaneously starting to prune a lot of memories they don't need. Their brains are getting rushed with dopamine, and they are creating systems that they will have for a really long time. That's why mental health is important. It's not important just because kids have mental health disorders. It's important because we can build mental health in order to address and cope and deal with things that are happening today so that we are better prepared for the future. Mental health isn't something you do just when you have a problem. It's not something you do just when something's wrong. It's something that you build and you foster and you grow, like your physical health. So that's a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. It's the briefest overview I can give you. I did want to leave time for some questions. There is coffee here now as well. I know that's exciting for everyone. So if you want to get up, get a cup of coffee, you want to ask some questions, I can handle them. Are there any questions? Yeah. For coping or? Yeah. So I think what's that?
For mental health in general.
Sure, yeah. So I think the way you talk about mental health and model it for your kids is important. I think unintentionally, because of the way this mental health spectrum works, people have always been afraid to say like, well, I take care of my mental health because they don't want to be associated with having a mental health disorder. So the spectrum I'm going to explain to your students, your kids today, has different parts on it. So one part is like able to balance, and these are people who don't really have to think about their mental health much. They don't have a lot of stress. They don't have a lot of triggers. They don't have a lot of traumas or experiences happening. These are the people I hate most in life, but they exist. So that's able to balance. Difficulty balancing would be like, oh, I have some stress, I have some triggers. I'm just not actively working on my mental health. Needing help to balance could be someone who is a diagnosed, who needs medication, who needs treatment. It could also just be somebody who needs to run every day, listen to music every day, exercise, talk to a friend, do something active for their mental health. A lot of you in this room are already needing help for your mental health. You're just not classifying it that way. You know what you need every day to actually like make sure you're balanced. You're just not classifying it under mental health. Needing constant assistance to balance could be somebody who's in like AA or NA, or it could be somebody who, a lot of you have seen this. Someone in your family went through something traumatic and you decided you just weren't going to leave them alone. So you cooked for them, you made sure they slept, you took care of them. They needed constant assistance to balance. They needed someone in their family to help them until they were able to be okay. And then unable to balance could be someone who's suicidal, but it could also just be somebody who went through something so traumatic that no matter what they try, no matter their coping skills, no matter who's around them, they're not able to balance. All of you in this room have been in that place too. 2 weeks before my school was opening at UCLA, I got like probably the most devastating news of my life. My brother called and told me that my dad had passed away. And at the time, my dad was super healthy, not sick, not on anyone's radar, and it was shocking. All of you in this room have received news that's shocking. And I went from somebody who needs help to balance to somebody who was unable to balance in seconds. And I was unable to balance for months. All of you know that grief is a really, really difficult thing. Being unable to balance had nothing to do with my functionality. I was unable to balance. I still went to school every day and taught every day. I still had a master's program. I was still married. So we need to stop talking about mental health in terms of you have an illness or you don't. Think about how you balance and start modeling that for your kids. Start saying like, hey, I need help to balance my mental health. I need to exercise. I need to talk to my friend. I need to do these things. And if you start modeling it, it'll help. So changing that language at home is important. The second thing is actually just naming coping skills. When I was in high school, if somebody would have been like, hey, I think you drink to cope, I would have been like, no, I don't. I just like it. I like partying. It's cool. I'm not coping. So we have to actually start naming what coping skills are. And if you focus on like, hey, this is going to help build you, this is going to help make you stronger, there's a big difference between effective and ineffective coping. That can help open your son or daughter to that concept. You as a parent play a critical role in this. If you're like, you need to cope more effectively, and then you're playing Fortnite with them or like doing something else and it's excessive, that's going to stick for them. So talking about effective coping, there are a lot of effective coping mechanisms out there. They don't often feel as good as some of the things that their dopamine-wired brains are seeking, but getting them involved in mindfulness or meditation, getting them even involved in just like being quiet, getting away from screens, taking time for themselves, something active, exercise, music, something that does release that dopamine in a positive way. Anything that you see can help release their emotions, because it's different for everybody. Some kids like to write. I have students who are like, I went home and I painted for a while. I'm like, okay, if that works for you, great. I would not have chosen painting, and that's why I share this. Like, everyone has different releases. Some people look at religion. Some people look at all other kinds of things as their release. And so it's not so much about teaching what is the best coping mechanism, it's finding the one that works best for them. And then outside of that, how you talk about stress is really important. These kids are in a system where they feel like they have to be perfect just to get into college. And then once they get into college, and college is now like $70,000 a year, there's pressure to do well, there's pressure to always get ahead, there's pressure to always be the best. Letting them know that they can fail and teaching them about those differences between good stress and bad stress is important. There's a really amazing TED Talk called How to Make Stress Your Friend. Watch it together and then talk about it. But I think the most important thing you can do in your homes is just really normalize the concept of mental health instead of isolating that it is just mental illness. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the personal side. And
Sure.
I think hopefully you'll have a lot of people in the audience this afternoon are feeling they can do more.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm wondering is maybe for the school, do you know what's happening next after the presentation? Like what are the kids going to be told, or what will be available to them after this dynamic, powerful presentation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, hopefully we can work with Ross and maybe use his curriculum. That's one piece we really want to do. But like I mentioned earlier, we have a structure in place on Wednesdays where that is an area of focus for us. And it's about kind of building that curriculum and creating an environment where we can have our teachers feel comfortable talking to our kids about exactly what Ross just mentioned. So it's not going to be a one and done. This is kind of what we've been building off of for the last year. We want to continue to do that. But I think using the curriculum in association with the structure that we already have in place and making it a part of the common vernacular that we use in this building. So it's not just about preparing our students for the next class they're going to take next year, but how do we incorporate it into what we're doing every single day? That's the piece that we want to focus on.
And if I could just add, also one of the things that we've been working on as a pre-K-12 division is really establishing a comprehensive counseling program for all of our students in all of our schools. And then it's a time that if we're taking the time to build it appropriately and what's right for our kids and slowly but surely implementing the things that all of our students need to hear and having these hard conversations, starting in school, talking about feelings, talking about mindfulness, talking about who they are and how they can help themselves and how we can support them as a community. We are starting at the pre-K level and moving up to school by school.
And I want to stress that it's not easy. The culture change of that is not easy. So like I take the students at my school to big panel discussions on mental health like around Los Angeles and the country. And so all the other kids on the panel will be like, if we just had a school that talked about mental health and it was in classes and that would change everything. And then I'll turn to my kids and be like, you have this school, how is it? And they're like, it's hard. I've never really talked about it before, so I don't want to talk about it. And so like the fix sounds really easy, but when you're in it and now you're actually asking kids to do it, it's not as quick. It's a culture change. It takes time to build. It takes time to create. So there are small successes in that. And there are small successes in those changes. But having created a school around this and watching my students be like, but I don't want to talk about it. And I'm like, but everyone is saying this is what you want. We're doing it now. And then you're in that parent role where you're like, oh man, I gave them what they wanted, but they don't actually now want this. So I'm just saying, like, be patient. Because what it requires is a consistent effort from the adults to be like, this is how we're doing this. And then, the students buy in. If you try it once and it doesn't work, and then you're like, okay, my bad. As all of you know, as parents, that creates a whole other paradigm where now they have the control. Because, a lot of childhood is just manipulating you and you trying to manipulate them to do things. So you don't want to get into that role. You want to say, as a school, this is what we're doing. And then eventually that culture starts changing, but it takes time.
Remind me when you started your school?
Just 2 years ago, so we're only been operating for like a year and a half. Yeah.
I appreciate the aspect of normalizing personal care and around the mental health. As we know, a lot of teens in this age group reflect in their identity is surrounded by their peer groups. And as you mentioned, the peer group discussion often is a competition of how stressed can I be? What skills, and will you talk about how you shift that dialogue in that peer group setting to what are affecting coping skills and how they become mutually reinforcing in that identity, so that when the kid who is off doing all that individual care doesn't feel like the weirdo loner kind of doing that, and the rest of the group is having their stress competition.
Yeah, and so I address it in the presentation, but it does have to be a culture change. Yeah. Like for that individual to stand up and be comfortable enough to stand up and say that, there has to be some culture supporting it, where they're like, oh yeah, I did sleep last night. Like, I'm not actually just in this competition. And then helping other people see like, okay, this is okay to do. Because what a lot of students do now is binge sleep. So they'll like sleep 4 to 6 hours a night on school nights, and then when they get a week off or a day off, they'll sleep for like 16 hours. And that's not effective. So trying to just balance that out. So yeah, we talk about it, but there also has to be that element of reinforcement in other areas. Any other questions? Yeah.
Sometimes part of the cultural issue that we experience is what we're preparing our kids for.
Right.
What that means, right? So our kids, many of our kids go on to post-secondary university, and as you were saying, UCLA is one of the hardest schools to get into. University of Virginia is not a lot different. How do you talk with kids about there's a school for everybody and finding your right fit and being who you are and letting that be the right fit? How do you work with
Well, I think one of the most important things is, like, with the college mental health crisis, colleges are now trying to promote and teach all these skills by the time for students who are at the college level. So one way to approach that is like, what if you learned this before you got to college, so that you're even more prepared and more advanced than the students around you? That's just one way of framing mental health care. That's what we do a lot at our school, is like, because UCLA now has 54 counselors and a wait list and can't keep up with the amount of students who are actually coming for help. And the kids coming for help don't have severe mental health disorders. They just don't know how to talk to a roommate. They're stressed out. They're not sleeping. They don't know how to ask somebody out on a date. And that's what they're flooding the counseling center with. So what if you learn these skills now? You'll be better prepared for college. The second piece of it is, again, whatever you can do from a school perspective of letting them know that it's okay to have rejection and to have failure and to have mess ups, because they're going to find their own path. So not even so much about there's a college for everybody, but it is okay to face adversity. a lot of students who are in such a mode of perfectionism don't really also want any adversity. One thing that I see a lot is like, there's this whole push. So if you ask this generation, are they okay with a friend or someone else seeking help? They have the lowest percentage of stigma in US history. Almost 100% of kids of this generation are like, yeah, my friend should seek help. I support that. And then if you're like, would you seek help? They're like, well, I don't need help. But if my friend does, cool, but I don't actually need help. And even if you're like, you're doing all the same, you are your friend in this scenario. They're like, I don't need it. So that level of perfectionism is coming from a place of like, I got this. I can take care of this. I must be able to take care of this. And so obviously framing it from a place of like, there's a college for everybody, but also letting them know like, whatever you do, you're going to have difficulty. You're going to have things that don't work out in the way you want. How can you work past that? There was another question?
I was just curious, is this presentation going to be taped? And will the parents, when he did this later one?
Yeah.
Will the parents be able to see this online somewhere?
All right.
You referenced some resources, like the books, or
Yeah.
do you have, is there any other place we could look for things to read or view later other than the presentation that you would suggest, either our kids or ourselves?
Yeah, I think, so for social emotional learning, like just learning how to actually talk about emotions, the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence does a really great job. And they have a program that is kind of social emotional learning for K through 8, but it really helps apply if you're like struggling and figuring out like, how do I actually talk about emotions? That's a really good one. And then there's other information about mental health that I think can be really useful as a parent. There's the Child Mind Institute is really helpful out at I think it's still out of NYU. Yes. Sorry. There's a lot. Yeah. So those are two really good resources. I think the reality is mental health education is just still forming. So like on one side, you have social emotional learning, and social emotional learning is like character education. It's like, this is what a feeling is. This is how you identify it. This is how you talk about it. But it doesn't necessarily focus on coping skills. And so that's on one side. On the other side, you have like mental illness education. And I'm calling it mental illness education because that's all it is. There's a really amazing program that is used worldwide called Mental Health First Aid. But Mental Health First Aid is just teaching you all of the major warning signs and symptoms of the most highly diagnosed mental health disorders. So for me, that is not mental health education because there's no definition of mental health in that. And what it's actually saying is it's mental health first aid, but here are all the disorders you can have, not here's how you take care of yourself. I think it's a useful piece of education. I think it's helpful, but somewhere in the middle is mental health education. And that is not as fully developed yet. My curriculum is one of the only mental health curriculums in the country because you either have SEL or you have mental health first aid, but you don't have someone saying, let's blend it and let's destigmatize seeking help, because that's where the fear is. SEL, social emotional learning, kind of teaches like everyone has feelings, everyone has emotions, everyone has moods, but it doesn't go to the point of if you have problems, you should seek help. And then mental health first aid is like, if you have a disorder, you should seek help. We need a middle ground. This country is always desperately in need of something to come through the middle and be like, okay, I see these both polar opposites. Here's how we blend the two. And so the reality is we're on the forefront of developing that kind of education. Yeah, one more question and then I have to go to speak to the kids. Yeah.
When you talked about the not getting coping mechanisms when you were young,
Uh-huh.
and then your mental illness later,
Mm-hmm.
can you connect them?
Yeah, so
Would your experience have been different?
I think that the experience would have been different. I can't blame anyone for that though. Like I can't sit here and be like, well, my parents didn't teach me how to cope, because the homes my parents grew up in were far worse. My dad grew up with an alcoholic father who, my dad was never hugged or told he was loved. He never had a birthday party. He never had a friend visit him. He lived in constant fear of physical violence that he saw on his mom, his brother, his sister, himself. So when my dad had 3 boys and decided he would hug us every day and tell us he loved us every day and give us birthday parties. That was 1,000,000% change from his childhood. My mom grew up with a mother who had bipolar disorder and was an alcoholic. So sometimes my mom came home to like music and baking and cookies, and sometimes my mom came home to a really dark place. So my mom, as a mom, was like, oh, I'm going to create a stable home environment. So can I go back and be like, well, these people didn't teach me how to cope? No, because they changed their childhoods 1,000,000% and made sure I grew up in a home they didn't grow up in. So when I talk about my coping skills, I think the most difficult aspect of this is all of your kids want autonomy, and the places they want autonomy in is typically their emotional development. And the choices they make as they start regulating their own emotions in adolescence can have longer consequences. Had I been able to express my emotions, and had I not chosen alcohol as a coping mechanism before I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it would have went a lot differently. I would have been okay expressing my feelings. I would have understood it. I may have accepted bipolar disorder earlier, and I wouldn't have gone through the years of alcohol abuse that I did. But there's also a biological element to this that I can't change. Depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, and addiction are on both sides of my family. So it wasn't like I just grew up in this Pollyanna universe where like my brain wasn't hardwired for alcohol abuse and depression. It was. So I think that's why coping skills are so important. Now we know enough where you can start like guiding kids on coping skills. Most of the students at my school have a 504 plan or some other plan for assistance of like, this is how we can help you in education. We just need to extend that wherever we can. But one of the hardest things you might face as a parent is trying to parent out your personality from your own kid. You know, like my parents loved to drink. So when I was drinking, it wasn't like they were like, well, this is going to end badly for him, because they were like, look at us. We're alive. We're here. That's one of the hardest things, is how do you parent out yourself? I do have to go. Thank you very much. Good luck. Thanks, everybody.